Hello everyone, this is Ponder on Weather. In this update, we're going to be detailing out the next 7 days so you can plan ahead and stay ahead of the storm. This is your Friday afternoon update, so we got a lot to cover. So let's delve into the details and take a look at the overall big picture this afternoon. Let's start off here in the Pacific, where things have been just pretty much gangbusters out there. They've seen storm after storm. This is actually Georgette down here, and this is actually Frank. So we've got two named storms in the Pacific. So it's been very active of these systems coming off Central America here and getting out in the open waters. We've got plenty of well above average sea surface temperatures out here, which has been keeping this activity alive. That's also been prevalent with this monsoonal flow that's been really active as of late. In fact, even downtown Las Vegas had some flooding last night. And we've had this pesky cold front that's just been kind of sitting here for days now. Very light steering currents. And with that, you have these training supercell thunderstorms, which unfortunately brought all the flash flooding to places like into St. Louis the other day. And then you brought all that devastating flooding into portions of eastern Kentucky. And unfortunately, the death toll is up to 16 now. I mean, the pictures there are just insane, all the devastating flooding. And my heart really goes out to those folks out there. But further to the south, it's been nothing but high and dry with this sinking air, this dominating ridge of high pressure. And you can actually, as we delve into the open waters of the Atlantic, it's pretty much quiet as well. This little standout here is this open wave whale out here in the open waters of the Atlantic. That's going to be pushing westbound, but that's plenty of open territory. We also have another little area of convection right around the Cayman Islands as well. That's actually going to be slowly drifted into the portions of the Gulf of Mexico. And then you also have this little sea breeze action here too as well, bringing some instability along the coast. But the main activity has been right along this frontal boundary, and that's where they've been experiencing all the flash flooding as late, and that is going to continue for the next couple of days. In fact, let's take a look at this overall setup and how this is playing out. You've got Frank down here with this low pressure, 991 millibars, and all these high pressure rotates clockwise, and when it does that, you basically have sinking air. When you have sinking air, it's very difficult to rain in that atmosphere. Then you can actually see here, we got a low pressure system basically off the coast of California into Arizona. That's actually bringing, rain to those areas with this active monsoonal flow, and the heat is really starting to build in the Pacific Northwest and then really prevalent in Texas. But you see these colors where they change this into orange. That's the sign of that cold front that's been really traversed along this boundary into portions of Kansas and Missouri, back into Tennessee, getting into Kentucky here. That's where they've been inundated with all the very heavy rainfall. That's actually going to be slowly drifting further south. And as it does, that'll actually help pull the rain showers and all the heavier rain. But again, you going into late July and going into August, these cold fronts aren't going to be sinking that far south. It's going to be putting on the brakes somewhere around the Red River this afternoon. In fact, this is the latest update from the Storm Prediction Center. They do have a marginal risk. So with all the heat in the atmosphere that's building up in the upper levels, any storm that does develop along this boundary can produce some strong downburst winds. And they're not really typically very much heavy rain producers, but they can be very high wind producers as well. But where they does rain with those very low steering currents aloft, they can actually put some pretty significant rain amounts, but other areas basically next to nothing. So yeah, mainly it's going to be areas into Oklahoma. Really not expecting terribly too much along the Red River, and of course further south where they desperately need it in Texas. Yeah, I mean, just consider yourself really lucky if you do see some scattered pop-up shower activity, about 20% chance. But once you get up here into portions of getting into Virginia, back into say DC, into Delaware, those areas could be seeing some stronger wind gusts of up to 60 miles an hour, qualifying for those slight risk for severe storms. And then some of those could be out on the little bit larger hail producer side, but that's why they have got that slight risk for severe weather up there. But you can take a look at the overall 24-hour precipitation, With the active monsoonal flow, I expect more rain tonight, getting into later on this afternoon. Typically, this area gets active once they have heat up in the atmosphere. So things are starting to warm up right now. And so things should start to bubble up as we get deeper into the afternoon time frame. And that's really going to be prevalent over New Mexico as well. But also that bullseye where that cold front is really stagnant and lying right along the far extreme portions of the Texas Panhandle. You're going to be seeing the heaviest rain. Far extreme portions of western panhandle of Oklahoma as well, with lighter amounts as you get into Oklahoma and basically McAllister, and very lighter amounts as you get towards the Red River. And fortunately, a lot of this area where they have all the heavier rainfall as of late won't see as much. You're still going to be seeing some, but you won't see as much over the next 24 hours. But here's the overall temperatures as we get into tomorrow, and you can definitely see where the main cold air and where mainly the instability will be further to the north into Kansas, into Missouri, and that creeps into the far extreme portions of Oklahoma. Again, once you pull further south, the pretty much puts on the brakes as they get towards the Red River. So Dallas, again, basically the south of that boundary, you're going to be lucky if you get a rain shower where these areas just been desperately needed rain. So again, it's still there. I mean, you have like a 20% chance, but it's not much. You need nothing drought producer busting or anything out of that stretch in the imagination. And up into the Pacific Northwest, where they have been experiencing those well above average temperature anomalies. I think Seattle hit 94 yesterday. You're going to be still inundated with that heat bubble over the next couple of days, but there are signs at the end of the tunnel. As we get really, especially into the middle of next week, that heat wave is going to be putting on the brakes for that region, as we got a pretty significant trough that's going to be diving into that part of the country. But if you combine the overall rain amounts for today and going in through all the way into Sunday morning, essentially the heaviest amounts were where it's going to be, mainly where that cold front is going to be lying, essentially north of the Oklahoma City area, right in the northern portions of Oklahoma, northern portions of Arkansas, southern portions of Missouri, as well as southern portions of Kansas. And then where you desperately need it the most in Texas, there's just not much to speak of, because you got to have some sort of rollover effect with some sort of, lift in the atmosphere. You've got a dominating ridge, sinking air, and that type of atmosphere. It's just very difficult to break down that pattern. We need that cold front to be able to do that. But if it doesn't sink that far south, of course, it's getting into the end of July and August. Cold fronts just typically don't make it into Texas in August timeframe. So unfortunately, you're going to be staying high and dry. But as we get into Sunday, that cold front retreats further back to the north. So all those areas in Oklahoma that are experiencing the rain the next 2 days are going to be high and dry themselves. But now it's setting up shop again, unfortunately, as it lifts further back north again. So a lot of those same areas that really don't need the rain are going to get inundated more into Tennessee, back into Kentucky again, back into Virginia. Those areas have been inundated as of late, and you're going to be compounding to those flooding issues as we get into your Sunday time frame. But as we transfer into Monday, so that's where we start to see these subtle changes in the atmosphere. So this dominating ridge of high pressure in the North American view still prevalent over the Pacific Northwest, but we do have a subtle trough that's going to be creeping in off the coast, and this is going to be building over time. So as we get into Monday, you're not going to really feel the effects as of yet, but this high pressure will slowly start to weaken, if not almost start to fizzle out, as this trough really starts to overtake and expand into the West Coast, as we have another fairly significant trough well up into Canada, and that's going to be pulling some cooler instability into places into Minnesota, into Wisconsin, getting into places into Michigan there. And as we get deeper into portions of Illinois, this high pressure that's going to be centered over Texas will weaken, but it'll actually essentially move a little bit further north as we get into the middle of next week. So let me show you that over on the overall jet stream. So we've got this little instability right here with this low pressure right off the North American coast. That's the indicative of the low pressure and the changes in the atmosphere. High pressure still dominating for your Monday standards for to start August. But as this low pressure will slowly start to creep onto the coastline, this high pressure will slowly start to fade, and these high pressures will be pressed. It will actually be compressed and move further into the north central states, and those areas are going to be starting to heat up in a big way, especially as we get into the middle of next week. So by the time we get into Tuesday, you can see a lot of the drier air coming back into portions of the Pacific Northwest. You've been dry. You're going to actually be staying dry for the foreseeable future, as we've got a lot of dry air sneaking in again more off into the coast, as a lot of that instability will be further again. That active monocidal flow will continue to remain active, but we'll also be looking out for this little feature down here that's showing its head off into the south, to the southeast. This is what they call an easterly wave, right? And so it's a little area of low pressure center that has some instability, more or less sea breeze activity, but that will actually slowly, again, drifting slowly, right? Low steering currents, slowly drift further off into the west. So as we get into the end of next week, going into next weekend, it's probably going to be close enough into the Houston area, far extreme portions of East Texas, to bring actually some welcome rain for that area. So I'll show you that as it develops, as we get towards the middle of the week. So if we look at the overall precipitable water value index, these areas in red, it basically implies this atmosphere, once it gets heated up and the atmosphere is able to overturn itself, then that any storm that does form has the capability to be in pretty strong downburst winds, and as well as heavier rain producers, because the precipitation water values are at about 2 inches. So those areas in New Orleans, basically essentially Mobile, right along the coastline into the Florida panhandle. So some of those areas could be looking at some heavier downpours. And again, as we creep into the end of next week, that instability will slowly start to drift further off into the west, bringing some beneficial rains in far extreme portions of East Texas, into portions of the far southeast Texas, essentially say in the Houston area. As we have further to the north, we'll have the high pressure really start to develop and really start to expand and overtake itself into portions of the central plains as we get into the middle of next week. But yeah, if we take a look at the overall big picture on the sea surface temperature anomalies, you can see the La Nina indicative right here in the Eastern Pacific, and all those cooler waters is alive and well, and that's not going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, there's actually some signs now it's reversing course and actually kind of getting a little bit stronger now, with a big easterly burst in the trade winds out there. So I expect the La Nina to actually intensify over the next couple of weeks. And so, but we've got well above average temperature anomalies in the Gulf of Mexico, really into the Caribbean. Really, you got below average temperature anomalies in the main development region, but there's not much really activity. We got a lot of sinking air in this area. We've got a lot of, that Saharan dust. It's still prevalent for this time of year. So the tropics are quiet. I mean, there's no question. It's actually pretty quiet right now. In fact, I was just reading the last storm it actually dissipated was a depression back on July the 2nd. It's been July the 2nd since we've actually had some sort of named storm in the Atlantic. And there's not much expected between now and say August 3rd. And if that happens, there's only been 4 times since records have began that there was no storms in those 30-day activities. So that's kind of rare territory, that we're getting deeper into the Atlantic hurricane season. We've only had 3 storms, and on the Pacific side we're up to what now? So it's been very active on the Pacific, and I do think things are going to be turning around, but it's going to be a while. I think it's going to be at least a couple of weeks. Then there are some signs in the very extended range, say the 3rd week of August, things should start coming around. Peak season September the 10th. So I mean, it should come around by then to have more activity, because we're still expecting an above average season on the Atlantic side. So, but yes, as we get into Thursday, it's really going to be showing its head with that deepening trough into the Pacific Northwest. So you can say goodbye to the heat wave up there in the Pacific Northwest, all those well above average temperature anomalies. If you're baking Portland right now, if you're baking in Seattle, if you're baking in a good chunk of Washington and Oregon, things are going to be settling down. It's going to go back to where it was, and temperatures are going to be, where they should be this time of year, in the 70s, if not some approaching 80 degrees, but it's not going to be in the 90s, not going to be in the hundreds. So things are really going to be getting back to, say, normal or even below average standards for this time of year. As the ridge of high pressure, what it's actually going to be doing is that's going to compress this high pressure into the midsection of the country, because we've got all this low pressure off the west coast, right? We've got the active monsoonal flow over the Four Corners region that pushes the heat bubble into the central plains, and will actually help intensify. It will help intensify that ridge over a good chunk of the central plains. And so by the time we get into Thursday, here's your overall average temperatures for this time of year. So like, say by the time we get into August 4th time frame, what is, when you say normal, or is when you say average, what does that imply, right? And so it typically, your average high for this time of year, say in Dallas, is at around 97 degrees, right? So your average high in a good chunk of Oklahoma is middle 90s, low 90s. As you creep further north, it's right around 90 degrees in Kansas. This is what you typically would normally be just in a normal day on August the 4th. Well, mid 90s, low 90s along the southeast. But as you creep back into Tennessee, back into Kentucky, you're talking upper 80s. But once you get into the Illinois area, you're talking middle 80s, if not lower 80s, depending on where further north you go in Illinois. And if not 70s, back into Wisconsin, going into Minnesota, and then lower 80s as we get into, say, Iowa areas. So that's what normal looks like. But with the ridge of high pressure going to be dominating that section of the country, we're going to be cranking out 103 degrees, which for Dallas, it's hot, but it's only about 6 degrees above average temperatures. But as you creep further north, right? So when you get average temperatures in the 80s, now we're talking 105, 106 degrees. That's a little bit different, right? Because now we're talking 20 degrees above average versus, say, 6 degrees average, even though it's technically around the same temperature. But that ridge of high pressure will be dominating over the central plains and bringing those well above average temperatures, lifting further to the north, if not into the Dakotas. That actually could spread all the way up into Montana. Even Canada could be in the 90s by the time we get into your Thursday time frame. And even in the Northeast, you heat up as well. So the cooler air come back. Look, we're talking 60s, right? That's more like it, right? We're not 100. We're not in the 90s over here along the coast. So this is 60s. This is what it, hey, this is nice weather out there, right? And so, but look what's crazy. Back here into the desert Southwest, where you got all the rain around, and all the desert Southwest where it's supposed to be, 110 every single day. It's not happening. Not with all that cloud cover and not with all that rain. You're going to be experiencing those well below average temperatures into the desert Southwest, with that monsoonal flow going to be alive and well. That's what I'm talking about being compressed. When you have low pressure off the West Coast, dominant monsoonal flow, that compresses the heat in the midsection of the country. And that's where you get your highest temperature anomalies with those temperature pressure gradients out there. But yes, like I mentioned, as we go into Friday, we've got those higher fat levels coming into Friday, slowly compressed off that easterly wave, getting into Louisiana, getting into Houston, getting into East Texas, where they desperately need the rain. And as we get into your Saturday, boom, check it out. That's where it's going to be wringing out that moisture, dropping some much needed rain. This won't be until a week from now, but hey, you look for any signs, because this is a deepening trout into Texas. So any signs of any hint of rain, we got to mention it, right? And so it's going to be really based on that easterly wave moving across, from off the East Coast all the way through off the Southeast, and eventually heading into Texas. But that won't be until Saturday. And you can definitely see it on the temperature anomalies as we get into next weekend, with those well above average temperatures back into the monsoonal flow back off the West Coast, with those well above average temperature anomalies highlighted over the upper Midwest into the northern and central plains, with those if not 90s, if not some temperatures up into the 100-degree mark. And then beyond that, you can definitely see where the easterly wave will be setting up shop in a good chunk of South Texas and East Texas. It's going to be fighting the ridge, right? So it's going to be fighting the ridge. And so as you get further into the deep of Texas, I'm not expecting much else to get rain, especially like say in North Texas or even Central Texas. But if you live along the coast, if you live into East Texas, I am expecting rain from that easterly wave, as the ridge of high pressure will be dominating with that sinking air over the midsection of the country. And then as the ridge will creep up further to the north as we get into next weekend, that's going to be putting the highest temperature anomalies where you typically expect 80s, low 80s for this time of year. You're going to be in the upper 90s, if not in the hundreds for temperatures as we get into next weekend. So, but the overall big picture as far as the rain amounts, you can definitely see where all the action is going to be. You can definitely see where all the ridge of high pressures are going to be as well, with the main instability as a lot of the rain activity will ring itself out over Tennessee and good chunk of Kentucky again, and then we'll be following that easterly wave moving across the southeast and eventually heading into Texas as we get into next weekend. So hey, I appreciate you guys watching. Do follow me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter for all the updates when I'm not updating on YouTube on a daily basis. And then also hit the subscribe button if you hadn't already, and catch me in the next update where I protect you before and after.